Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for to the host for having me. I hope to give all of you an idea of the factors that went into developing a process for adoption at FDA for study animals. So again, these are my opinions, not endorsed or official of the FDA. I'll throw that in there. Initially wanted to start off with discussing some of the challenges that federal agencies have, not necessarily unique to federal government agencies, probably a little different than the state or private organizations deal with. And then I'll get into our FDA guideline and then how we arrived at it. But a lot of this started with the public pressure for adoption programs that's been mounting for a while now. They had some issues at the VA with canine research, with the USDA with feline research that brought a lot of attention to, I guess, what are considered companion animals or pets in research. And that led to a lot of states passing laws. One that happened here where we are in Maryland, the Humane Adoption Companion Animals Used in Research Act of 2018. And over the last 7 years or so, 13 states have passed laws, and several with laws that are pending now. But again, these typically don't apply to federal facilities, but may apply to many of the rest of you. Federal agencies, or federal laws and actions, mostly pending ones, none have actually passed per se. But we're seeing a lot of action on that. Typically, these would be applied to federal research facilities, and basically they're more or less pushing the federal agencies that have animal programs to offer animals up for adoption after completion of research. And here are a few of the acts that have been proposed. I don't think they've ever actually cleared both sides of Congress that is required to go into law, but basically pushing federal animal programs into at least having a plan or a policy, a written one, that would allow for adoption of study animals post research. Some committee reports that we're also receiving. Requests for information to support them in many cases, or what we're doing to facilitate adoption of animals at the end of research studies. So all these things are kind of adding up, and we're seeing them more frequently now, pushing towards that. There's a lot of those things going on, so probably a good way to keep up with it. Again, these are more science-based organizations, but there are a few of them that track a lot of the legislation that's going on at a state or federal level. And that's the National Association for Biomedical Research, NABR. Their updates, they have email updates on it, and also the American Society of Lab Animal Practitioners newsletter has a government and legislative section that reviews. A good one on that came out in 2019 that was shared with me recently that showed the summary of a lot of the federal and state legislative actions. Government property laws. Basically, in the government, whenever you buy something, services, or it's either services or property. And although I know that's kind of a touchy subject, there are a lot of rules and regulations on this. They even have groups of folks at the agencies that are devoted to contracts and purchasing. Whenever animals are purchased for studies or research, again, they kind of fall under the property laws of GSA. Another confounding thing with trying to set up adoption policy is there's a lack of specified congressional authority, which can equate to funding for adoption or retirement of animals. A few exceptions to that. Military dogs, for example, have specific laws governing their disposition after service. And there are some spending authorities and budget for doing that. Typically, they would go to handlers to live out the rest of their life. after service, but there is no such legislation that exists for research animals. The GSA can assist with sales or auction. Typically, that would be of livestock. But the guidance that's, after talking to several agencies, the guidance does seem variable from GSA. It can include nominal sales along with donations, usually to state organizations or nonprofits. But again, all that has a lot of caveats and ins and outs, and a lot of maneuvering. So far as the funding goes, I had actually posted a thing on the ALAS Communities of Excellence. The link is there, should you guys get this later, asking about funding for adoptions and retirement of lab animals. And while many grants don't specifically forbid it, typically is not something that money is awarded for. And in many cases, some folks are told a grant actually won't cover the costs post-research, post-study. So a lot of it will fall on the lab or the institution that has it. In the federal government, we can typically only spend money that's appropriated for specific things. So that winds up being a little bit of a problem on the federal side. A little bit of the background of the effort at FDA. It's not really a new thing for the FDA. Back in 2015, we had a study. We very rarely have studies at FDA that involve animals you would typically think put up for adoption. But we did have a beagle study with a few animals back in 2015. And I was involved in that process where we actually did develop an adoption policy that was approved by the AWIC. Had a lot of fun on the legal side with the lawyers, where after a lot of back and forth, it was decided that people who were involved with the care of the animals, either federal employees or contractors, would be eligible to adopt the animals. Unfortunately, that there weren't any animals actually that were eligible for adoption at the end of that. That did lay a little bit of a base line for us going forward with it. In 2018, there was an event that did get some media coverage where we had some animals, some squirrel monkeys that were involved in studies that were retired. And that also kind of helped lead to the commissioner establishing the Animal Welfare Council, which was with FDA-wide representation of all the centers at FDA. We have several different centers that that divide up to the various responsibilities of FDA. And in 2019, the Animal Welfare Council was chartered organization. Words matter. One of the things we were tasked with was coming up with an adoption policy, but we decided to go for broader coverage to cover retirement as well as adoption and fostering and transferring of animals. And so because of that, and to kind of fit more with the property term, legal terms, disposition was thrown around, but folks didn't like that because it sounded a little bit too much like disposal. So we landed on placement. A policy on a federal level, agency level at least, has different meaning. So we were told we shouldn't use that term. So guideline was settled on. So in 2019, after a lot of review and back and forth, we finally came up with our guideline on the placement of research animals for transfer, adoption, or retirement. Again, like I said, we decided to cover all the disposition options in a single guideline. So the guideline, which started in November 2019, we're on the third revision of it. Actually working now on the fourth revision of it. I think if anybody comes up with their policies, as you move along through it, you'll see that it's something that things will come up that you realize you have to clarify or cover a little better. So we're probably coming up on our fourth revision. But they do cover adoptions and foster for adoption, transfer supporting biomedical research, retirement, and carcass disposal, just to the extent that programs need to have a written process for that. It was made public in 2020. We had congressional requests for a copy of it, and suddenly it popped up in the media. We don't actually have it posted outwardly on FDA.gov or an FDA page, but that's something that's being worked on. But it is out there and floating around. And that would be the original version of it. Guidance, it does have guidance for the FDA animal care programs on adoption. And it also specifies that the Animal Welfare Council will approve third-party recipients of foster or retirement organizations, and includes a requirement for animal transfer of ownership agreements, ATOAs, and that they lay out the responsibilities, legal requirements, and non-disclosures included in there too, are all incorporated into that document. The general things it covers, kind of the meat of the guidance, the purpose, policy, scope, eligibility, definitions, and responsibility all have sections. And then, of course, the housekeeping admin requirements, record retention, internal controls, references, and then the attachments would be those transfer agreements I had mentioned. We have a transfer because adoption and fostering, and then transferring for further research or retirement all are a little different. Each one has its own transfer agreement. Okay, a little bit on the sections themselves. In the purpose, it establishes FDA's position on adoption. We recognize that all animals will not be eligible, and that the program management and attending veterinarian can best determine the eligibility of the animals. But we do acknowledge that on occasions that animals can be transferred, adopted, or retired, and that FDA fully supports these things. One of the things when it came out in the press, news articles, they were kind of quick to call this a new FDA procedure or a change in procedure or policy, which it really wasn't. It was just a matter of more formalizing and coming up with an internal guideline to help our programs with guidance on the subject. That's actually something, I'll get into that GSA required. The eligibility or the caveats that were included in there is that the professional expertise is used to decide on eligibility for the animals. It has to be approved as a disposition in the animal study protocol. Public safety and health concerns are definitely of paramount importance and considered in this. The welfare of the animal, as well as the acceptable health and behavioral condition of the animal, is considered. And there are exclusions. NHPs for primates and transgenic or genetically modified animals are not allowed for adoption. The responsibilities that are covered in there is the Animal Welfare Council has overarching guidance on this for the programs. The animal programs themselves, the IO or delegate would approve the placements. The animal program management or the IACUC would also have responsibilities to ensure that it's covered in a protocol, as well as verify the eligibility of the animal and the fitness of the recipient. And the veterinary staff, of course, would complete assessments, exams, preventative care, and medical records that go with the animal as necessary. I think all things, typically you'd have to also have these items considered in there. The history, the research history as to whether the animal is eligible, liability risks, biosecurity issues, the species that it is, health status, temperament. And this last item, that's unfortunately kind of one of those things because anything in the government that we purchase is considered, property laws apply, and there's a lot of gray areas with that. And GSA again requires us to have a written policy on that. And one of the requirements that are in those federal regulations, it talks about whenever you're donating property or transferring ownership without actually selling it and stuff, it has to be of no monetary value to the agency or another federal entity. And they look at the cost of continued care, potential sale, and the original cost of the animal and all that. So all those things considered is what kind of went in to help us write the guideline that we had. References and resources that we used. No one in the federal government really seems to want to be the first one out on a limb on things. So we were looking at what others do. So we looked to our sister HHS organizations, the NIH and the CDC, to see what they were doing. And at the time we started to develop this, NIH had a memorandum that they came out with in 2014 that acknowledged that that adoptions could happen, and that the authority rests with the scientific director, which we have. That person works with our IOs basically as a science director in our centers, and we went ahead and just gave that responsibility to the IO or the IO's delegate, in that you must have a transfer of ownership agreement that's developed with the assistance of legal counsel. Again, we follow those things. Subsequently, NIH has actually developed their own policies and guidelines. Their Division of Veterinary Resources came out with an adoption policy about the same time we did in 2019. And the Animal Research Advisory Committee just came out with some guidelines, again, basically stating that their institutes, which are like our centers, should have a written policy on the disposition of animals and cover this topic. So we also looked at VA, and we have Alice, who's following me on this, to give a talk. I'll let her cover this in more detail. But when we looked at what the VA was doing, we saw that they had actually had their adoption policy publicly released, so we're able to read over that. Again, they were the first ones basically that had one, I think, for a federal agency, and we were kind of able to use that to help use a framework to put ours together. And it recommended that each of their programs establish an SOP, which is part of ours also, is that each of the programs develop their own SOP to supplement the guidelines that we have. OLAW has a FAQ on that they updated in 2020. Back then, very similar guidance on that was, basically the PHS policy and the guide are silent on the issue of adoption, but that it vests with the recipient, the grant recipient, to come up with a plan or program policy on that, and it must clarify that the disposition of animals acquired for research once it is ended, and it may include adoption. Which is very similar to, I guess, what USDA has, is they don't really, I haven't found anything actually in writing that says they support it, they just don't not allow it. So again, it's assumed in a lot of places. The professional organizations have come out with statements on it. The American College of Laboratory Animal Medicine, mentions that institutions should formulate their own adoption policy. And that acknowledges that the USDA provides institution the option for adoption. And I think that's more because they don't say you can't do it. So, and then OLAW supports the concept of adoption. ALAS, the American Association for Laboratory Animal Science, has a website. On their website, they have a page that goes over resources for adoptions with different forms and different institutional policies. So back in 2018, they had 12, and now they're up to 24 institutions that have policies, at least published on there. So you can use that as a resource too, if you're in the process of developing your own. We also looked at others that are fostering animals for adoption, kind of on a national level. There is Homes for Animals Heroes. And they're associated with the National Animal Interest Alliance, and again they have programs they have around the country, I guess, that will take animals, and typically they focus on animals that were in research, with fostering them and then finding permanent homes for them. And locally here in Rockville, Maryland, there's a group called Beagle Rescue Education and Welfare, BREW, which has a lot of awesome information in regards to beagles, since there's a lot of special things with that breed, and they have a really good paper that you can share with folks who are interested in adopting a beagle, and it goes over a lot of specifics of that breed that people should know before they decide to adopt a beagle. The other things I would encourage people who are thinking about a program would be to reach out to similar facilities to see what they're doing. And if all else fails, you can also do a Google search, and that will tend to show quite a few things. As I mentioned, as mentioned earlier by one of the speakers, that euthanasia is not generally considered an animal welfare issue, and other options, such as adoption, can get complicated and take resources that we don't really have. And in many ways, adoption makes no practical sense from an administrative standpoint. But there's no better satisfaction than to be able to successfully adopt out an animal after its contribution to science and our mission. So I want to say many thanks to all the animal caretakers, vets, and others that have put that extra effort out to find forever homes when they can for animals at the end of research being done. So in conclusion, I would say, the adoption of animals continues to garner attention and support. Federal facilities have the unique challenges. I covered some of those. Moving forward with formal programs and written publicly available adoption policies using both direct and indirect adoption methods. And the FDA has successfully implemented our adoption program of FDA-owned research animals following the establishment of our placement in research animals guideline. That concludes what I have. I'm not sure if I have time for questions on this, or I think we're taking them with the rest of the panel, but I do want to thank Kelly Decker, who put a lot of work into developing adoption programs for NIH, as well as helping us at FDA put it together. My boss, Rear Admiral Estella Jones, who supported and contributed to getting our guideline done, as well as the whole Animal Welfare Council, the centers themselves, and the animal care programs who have to work with us on that. Did a great job. The chief scientist, our chief counsel and Office of Policy, all who had to bless off and help tweak the language in it. And of course, GSA, VA, and NIH, who kind of came before us to help us get our guideline together. So that is all I have. Thank you.